Hey everyone, I have something really special to share with you. I'm hosting my first ever virtual tarot conference this summer that I know you're going to love. It's called the Summer Solstice Summit, and it's happening the weekend of June 20th. It's going to be a 3-day online gathering filled with tarot, astrology, shadow work, creative ritual, and all things witchy wellness. I've brought together 15 incredible presenters, folks I truly admire, ranging from therapists who are using tarot therapeutically to psychologists, astrologers, and of course, some of the most innovative tarot thinkers. All of these folks will be leading workshops and presentations designed to nourish your spirit and deepen your tarot practice. So, whether you're new to using tarot, especially as a tool for self-discovery and healing, or if you've been on this path for years, this summit is meant to meet you exactly where you are. And everyone is guaranteed to walk away with some healing witchy wisdom. I hope you'll join us for the Summer Solstice Summit. Go ahead and visit thetarotdiagnosis.com/summer solstice to get your weekend pass. You are listening to The Tarot Diagnosis. I'm your host, Shannon. I'm a licensed psychotherapist, and I also happen to have a love for tarot. Each episode, I invite you to reflect with me as I work to demystify the tarot and the human experience, all while exploring tarot's connection to mental and emotional health. While this podcast may feel therapeutic, it is not meant to take the place of psychotherapy. So grab your cards and join me as I work to create a pathway to better understand ourselves and those around us. Well, I'm doing it again. I just couldn't help myself. So if you know me, then you know my music taste is wild. I mean, I can be found listening to obscure metal bands from India to Halsey to Taylor Swift and Brooks and Dunn to prog rock. Music has always been a huge part of my life and my identity. And one of my favorite bands of all time is Sleep Token, and they just released their third single off of their upcoming album, Even in Arcadia, called Damocles. So just like I did for a Taylor Swift song a while back, I'm going to psychoanalyze Damocles and take a more Jungian approach to looking at the lyrics and really kind of diving into what Vessel, the vocalist, was trying to express. So I'm mostly going to be diving into the song lyrically. But before I do, I really want to take a moment to acknowledge the music itself, because Damocles is much more stripped down compared to what we're used to from Sleep Token. And I honestly think that choice is brilliant from both an emotional and psychological standpoint. It really feels like we're being invited directly into Vessel's world and his mind and his emotional landscape. And really maybe even perhaps into the inner experiences of 2, 3, and 4, the drummer, the bassist, and guitarist, as they really continue to navigate this rapid and what I can only assume is an incredibly overwhelming rise into fame. You know, they were relatively unknown up until, maybe 2 years ago. But the simplicity of the music of this particular song isn't just about making sure the listeners are paying attention to the lyrics. I do think that's probably a part of it, but I don't think that's the sole purpose of its simplicity. The simplicity itself just feels metaphorical, which is very Sleep Token, very much metaphor. It feels like a nod to the tension between enjoying the fruits of their labor, but also longing for the simplicity and the grounding of life before fame and before the pressure to keep creating in the way that they have. And in that way, this stripped back arrangement kind of mirrors that internal conflict that I think we see throughout the entire song itself. And while the music is simple, in comparison to, if you are a Sleep Token listener, you know that this song is simple in comparison to the complex layers that we're used to with their music, which, I think in some ways is what makes this particular song that much more exciting to listen to. Because also as fans, we've come to expect a certain pattern from them. They have this, really kind of enticing melodic dance that leads to this eventual climax of just mind-bending guitar riffs and sometimes these vocal cord shredding growls and just wickedly complicated, gnarly drum beats. So this song is quite a departure from that. And I think this seems to speak to this overwhelming pressure to continue creating masterpiece after masterpiece. And anyone who is an artist knows that pressure and knows just how unbearable it can be. So yeah, that's my initial thoughts on the music component behind this song before I really dive into the lyrics. And before I do that, before I get into the psychoanalysis and also the tarot layers of the song, because this is a tarot podcast. That's what I do. I, of course, am going to find ways to weave in the tarot. But I did want to share, I don't know, maybe a little fun fact about me that I don't know if really there's maybe a select few of you who know me personally know this. But before I became a therapist, I was actually a music journalist for like 6 years. It was crazy time of my life, probably one of the coolest, best times of my life. But yeah, I interviewed mostly rock and metal bands like Seven Dust and Behemoth and Meshuggah. And I reviewed music and concerts. So this episode that I was really excited to do and felt really called to do feels kind of like a nice returning home in this returning to kind of like an intersection as well of my two worlds currently, like returning home to this world that once was for me and also a world that currently is. And I'm not going to lie, I feel a little bit rusty and a little nervous to fully be reviewing and analyzing music in this way, but because it's really been so long. But I have spent the last 2 days since this song was released obsessing over the analysis of it. So I hope you all enjoy it. And if you're a Sleep Token fan, let me know what your thoughts are on my interpretation of this. Again, this is just my interpretation, my case conceptualization of the song. And if you're not a Sleep Token fan, please go listen because I guarantee you'll become one. Okay, let's get into it. So Damocles is a deeply personal, poetic expression of what I think it feels like to be an artist really in the midst of potentially an existential crisis, but solely related to fame and identity and this battle with the inner critic. On the surface, the song tells a story of Sleep Token's kind of just like, not even kind of, absolute meteoric rise to fame and how that's been accompanied by this inevitable onset of despair and anxiety and fear of collapse and losing it all, which we really see in the lyrics, which I'll get into more in a second. But, when we dig deeper, particularly through a Jungian and psychoanalytic lens, Damocles reveals a far more intricate and painful portrait of what it's like to be a member of this band. And I feel like it's one that speaks to a lot of the unconscious forces at work, especially beneath the persona that is presented on stage. So if you're listening to this very special episode, then I am assuming you're at least vaguely familiar with the band and the fact that they remain anonymous. So if you're not familiar, they wear masks on stage. They don't use their real names. We have no idea what they look like, so long as you have not gone and dug. But yeah, the lead vocalist goes by Vessel, the drummer goes by 2, the bassist goes by 3, and the guitarist is 4. And the anonymity of Sleep Token, I really think intensifies the burden and the weight that Vessel and perhaps the rest of the band is feeling right now. And in true Sleep Token fashion, though the band has created a song that not only reflects their personal experience, they've also created a song that functions as this universal exploration of, I think, the shadow self and the breakdown of a persona, and what I think is reflective of the need for this journey towards integration and individuation, a journey that is often perilous. So yeah, of course, they did a wonderful job, not only talking about their own personal experiences, but presenting it in a way that the listeners were also able to see themselves reflected back to them. So I've mentioned the persona a bit. In Jungian psychology, the persona is the social mask that we create and wear in order to meet the expectations of the world and society. This mask is not necessarily a false representation of ourselves. And when we think of masks, we can think, oh, like we're pretending to be something. It's a, we can even use the word persona as like, something that we're like acting out. It's not necessarily a false representation. It's just a very small, limited view of who we are. And it's a curated version of how we want to present ourselves to the world. The kind of interesting component here, and the persona is important in terms of how we function, but the danger of the persona arises when we start to over-identify with it. And that's when we start to believe that our persona is our whole, true, authentic self. And in the case of Sleep Token, you can see how this must be incredibly tension producing for them. Because, you have this tension between their persona, their stage persona. They literally have masks, literal masks that they wear. And then they have the whole true self outside of that. And so, yeah, there has to be some significant tension between the persona and the self when the persona is so wrapped up in everything that they do and create right now. So I think this is a big piece of the puzzle as it relates to their latest single. Another important component here too is when external validation starts to fade while we are existing in our persona, or when the mask that we wear starts to feel burdensome or unbearable, then we start to experience the collapse of the persona because it's, we've begun to solely identify with it. And when we experience the collapse of the persona after we've over-identified with it, then we start to experience a collapse of the self, or it can feel like the collapse of the self because we've over-identified with the persona too much. To relate this back to tarot, this would be like constantly seeing your own tower moment, like seeing you as your personas falling out of the tower and plunging to their catastrophic demise. So in the song, we see Vessel directly confront this kind of like persona disintegration when he says, "Who will I be when the empire falls? Who will I be?" Here the empire isn't just fame or success, even though that's a huge part of this song, which we're going to get into later. But it's also this very carefully curated identity that he's sustained, both to maintain anonymity so that he can live this public life, but also to create the experience of Sleep Token, where their anonymity allows listeners to project themselves and their own experiences onto the music. Or, this is cool, what the band calls or refers to as offerings. And without the empire, without the validation, the adoration, the spotlight, the container to hold this aspect, this part, this persona of Vessel, he's left facing this existential void. He's become potentially so over-identified with Vessel that once Sleep Token has run its course, when the empire falls, he feels he will have lost himself as well. Also, this question of who will I be when the empire falls isn't necessarily rhetorical. I think it's more of a statement of desperation. I think it's Vessel kind of standing on the edge of maybe an ego death, which, Jung talked about as this painful but necessary phase of the process of individuation, which is the whole point that we're striving to as humans is to become our whole authentic self. And I think this becomes more prominent when we remember that sleep token is anonymous. By removing their faces, removing their identities, they strip away the kind of usual pathways of projection. So listeners aren't engaging with Vessel the person. We're engaging with the archetypal and symbolic energy that he's embodying. So so normally we connect with the symbolism through the lyrics and through the music, but we're also able to connect with it through his persona, these themes of grief and dread and longing and despair and desire. I mean, the list goes on. Sleep Token and Vessel himself have become this living symbol of the collective unconscious, this vast container of the human experience that Jung believed we all have the ability to tap into. I want to take a moment to step back into the world of tarot because I specifically want to talk about the title of the song and the myth of Damocles and how it reminds me of the Emperor in tarot. Normally listening to the song, there's, the nod to swords, which I'll talk about in a second. So we really do think about the sword suit a lot, but the song and what it's embodying specifically reminds me of the image of the Emperor in the Somnia Tarot by Nicholas Bruno. And this is where Nicholas has portrayed the Emperor sitting on this, what would traditionally be a throne. In this case, it's just like, some big wooden chair. And then above the Emperor, he's holding on to the rope that is attached to this massive, scary looking anvil that is hanging above his head, which really drives home the pressure, anxiety, and hypervigilance that is required to maintain and just inherently accompanies power and fame. In the myth of Damocles, he craved the power and riches of kings. And eventually he was given that. But the king who bestowed this power upon him also hung this sharp sword over his throne, which was suspended by a single hair. And Damocles quickly realized that power and wealth seem wonderful until you are burdened by the constant danger and tension and anxiety that hangs over you when you are in that position. And in this case, Vessel doesn't necessarily just fear that sword falling. I get the sense that he's kind of welcoming it, especially when he says the line, "If only Damocles would hit me back." There's not this kind of desperate clinging to the throne here, or to tie it back to the image of the Emperor in the Somnia Tarot. He's not desperately holding that rope, hoping the anvil won't fall. Instead, Vessel might want the sword to fall. He might be ready for this tension and this anxiety and this hypervigilance to end. I imagine it's so overwhelming. Psychologically, this just feels like existential fatigue. This sense that destruction would be, preferable to the continual unbearable pressure of trying to hold it all together. And that's where this kind of other layer comes into this as well. This pressure and this burden to create. I don't think Vessel fears losing what he has. I think he's just crushed under the weight of having to keep producing what he has. So we hear this in the line, "I know I should be touring. I know these chords are boring, but I can't always be killing the game." So in a therapeutic context, this would be a clear case of the internalization of, hyperproductivity culture, which is, of course, fueled by capitalism. And we all know that capitalism and productivity culture, hustle culture are just torturous for creatives. And, it brings with it this belief that, your worth and your value is tied to your ability to either keep performing, creating, achieving, innovating, constantly having to make something better and outdo whatever you did before, which is why, I think Vessel is saying, hey, I know these chords are boring. I can't always be killing the game here. Also, the inner critic is so prevalent throughout this song. Music and writing, something that was was and is so sacred to Vessel, has now become this battleground for self-criticism and exhaustion, which this experience feels very much like the Seven of Wands, which could also represent the battling of the self, because we don't see anybody else in that image. We see, someone standing on this hill with a wand and all these other wands seemingly attacking them, but we don't see who they're really from. There's also an incredibly devastating line that Vessel says. He says, "And nobody told me I'd be begging for relief when what is silent to you feels like it's screaming to me. Nobody told me I'd get tired of myself when it all looks like heaven, but it feels like hell." There's a lot happening here, and I kind of want to go line by line, because I think that this verse specifically represents or identifies this experience of eventual identity collapse, or like inching towards that. So we have him saying, nobody told me I'd be begging for relief, which I think speaks to deep emotional burnout, potentially creative burnout too. We're not sure. This desire, not necessarily for fame, success, or even just more adoration, but I think it's the begging for relief for the internal suffering to stop, maybe the pressure he feels that he's putting on himself. And then we have what is silent to you feels like it's screaming to me. Which, oh my God, there's so many directions I could go with this, but I feel like this really captures the brutality of the inner critic. What looks like success from the outside is really inside just constant self-attacks. This could also possibly, if we're looking at this through a Jungian lens, represent a complex. So this kind of like splintered off part of the psyche that behaves more like an enemy to the self, where doubt and fear and self-loathing are just amplified through this complex. And, we can't hear into Vessel's mind, but he is telling us that, he's in this very Nine of Swords cycle right now, riddled with all these constant what if thoughts and what if statements, which, I actually hear him say what if multiple times throughout this track. And we all know anything that starts with what if is usually driven and fueled by anxiety. In this line, what is silent to you feels like it's screaming to me, also highlights this painful tension of cognitive dissonance. You think about it, I think cognitive dissonance is so prevalent here because that experience is created by being, worshipped by thousands of listeners and fans, while at the same time remaining relatively invisible. And the whole concept of cognitive dissonance happens when someone experiences these two kind of conflicting realities at the same time, which lead to significant psychological and emotional discomfort. So in this case, on stage, Vessel's at the center of just mass adoration. And off stage, he returns to silence and continued anonymity, and then potentially the loss or the absence of identity. I mean, this is absolute emotional whiplash between just, to use their kind of language and how they would describe this perhaps, but divine worship. So going from divine worship to utter solitude, I think would be just absolutely destabilizing or disorienting for anyone. But for an artist whose very identity is masked, that adoration that they're experiencing can't fully land because it's being directed towards what I mentioned earlier, this symbol, this archetype, not necessarily the true authentic self. So, Vessel's then left unable to truly reconcile this enormous energy of public worship with the internal void that follows once he's off stage. And, without a stable sense of self, those highs of performance coupled with the emptiness of anonymity just collide and create this explosion of a tower moment leading to the collapse of the persona, and then just accelerating that confrontation with either the shadow or confronting the very real need for a focus on individuation and probably more importantly, integration. We see more of this kind of signaling to the collapse of identity or really just the persona when Vessel also says, nobody told me I'd get tired of myself. He's tired of being the persona that had to create or that he had to create in order to bring life to Sleep Token. So from a psychological standpoint, there's possibly some depersonalization and just existential despair happening here. That feeling that there's nothing authentic left beneath that persona. And then there's the line, when it all looks like heaven, but it feels like hell. That again captures this persona shadow split. So like outwardly, life appears successful, maybe even enviable. We heard in Caramel, if you listen to that single before this one, that he doesn't want to be perceived as ungrateful. He's very much grateful for everything that's happening. But inwardly, he's, trapped. He's in agony, which I think this is a perfect example of the moon, where appearances can be deceiving. And, there's often a lot of struggle happening in the shadows. So ultimately, Damocles is not just Vessel lamenting about the pressure of fame or the exhaustion of creation. I think what we're seeing here is a painful and vulnerable display of persona collapse and the need for individuation and integration. I think that this song is, a recognition and acknowledgement that, there's no amount of applause or success, or to quote lyrics, no alabaster carving or faces on a farthing that can substitute for real, authentic wholeness. And in this case, rather than resisting collapse, Damocles invites it. I mean, the sword must fall, the persona must shatter. And Jung reminds us it's often only after the false sense has fallen away that true, authentic self can emerge. So in that way, this song isn't just a song about despair. Really, I think that it's a pathway towards a journey of becoming. Thank you so much for listening to the Tarot Diagnosis. For more tarot and mental health content, follow the Tarot Diagnosis on Instagram. You can also subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode, and sign up to receive the Tarot Diagnosis emails, where you'll have access to exclusive spreads and exciting announcements. To join an incredible community of tarot and psychology enthusiasts, join the Tarot Diagnosis membership community, The Symposium, by visiting thetarotdiagnosis.com.